Hello, welcome back to The Sower, a podcast of the Ciceronian Society. We publish weekly in audio on all platforms and in video for some episodes, including this one. So if you're listening right now, search our YouTube channel for the video version. To learn more about our programming to support cultural and civic renewal, please visit ciceroniansociety.org. Today's episode is a recording from our March 2026 conference. This is the second plenary panel titled Humanomics and sponsored by the Menard Family Center for Economic Inquiry. The speakers in order are Michael Thomas of Creighton University with an introduction to the panel, Stephen Mueller of Franciscan University of Steubenville with Catholic Social Teaching and Comparative Economic Systems on Free Enterprise and the Common Good. Then Paul Mueller of the American Institute for Economic Research with Philosophical versus Technical Economies, Diana Thomas of Creighton University, Dignity Relies on Providence, and finally, Michael Thomas again with closing remarks, Humanomics, is it a complement or a substitute? Here's the panel.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with a prayer to kick off this session. This will be a prayer for the intercession of St. Robert Bellamy, who is a Jesuit. So this is fitting for the Creighton panel that's hosting you guys here. Welcome. In the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. O Lord, you blessed St. Robert Bellamy with great wisdom and learning. May we, like him, use well the double gifts of faith and reason. May we grow in understanding our faith, diligence in living it, compassion in our service towards those in need, and in all things grow toward ever greater love of you. Through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you, panelists, for saying yes to doing this. I asked these panelists to come together in an extension of a special issue of Cosmos and Taxes that's coming out next month on humanomics. I was invited to serve as the special editor for that issue to think about a work by Nobel laureate Vernon Smith. He's up here, and his co-author, Bart Wilson. Also, about a year ago, Bart Wilson published a book called Meaningful Economics that tries to integrate Aristotle's four causes back into economics. So that's another connection to the Ciceronian here that I wanted to emphasize. Bart's insight connects us to another person that we should keep in mind, which is Mary Hirschfeld. She was a Harvard-trained PhD economist who paused her career and went back to school at Notre Dame to get a PhD in theology. This process produced her book, Aquinas and the Market, Towards a Humane Economy. Her point that markets are functional if they're subordinate to virtue and human flourishing is a claim that there is a way to do economics when you articulate formal and final causes. She left economics because it could not be fixed from the inside. Right? Without theology, or maybe without the humanities. This fits well with Bart Wilson's thesis that the formal and final causes are necessary for humanomics. This gives us something to talk about here at the Ciceronian Society. How do we humanize economics? You're invited to help us understand that, so that it delivers on the purpose of our society, the cultural and civic renewal through the pillars of tradition, place, and things divine. I'd like to introduce the panelists. The first one is Steve Mueller, professor of economics at Franciscan University at Steubenville. His research focuses on economic inequality and labor policy, and he's been published in several academic journals, including Public Choice, Intelligence, Critical Review, and Public Opinion Quarterly. Steve has been asked to do a complementary analysis between economics and Catholic social teaching based on his article in this special issue. He looks at human dignity, the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity, and argues that the free enterprise system does a good job, the best of the ones that he surveys, on delivering on human flourishing and the principles that define it. The second panelist is Paul Mueller. He's a research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research and the Associate Director for Religious Liberty in the States Project at the Center for Culture, Religion, and Democracy. He owns and operates a bed and breakfast, the Abbey, in Leadville, Colorado. where he lives with his wife and 6 children as of October. Paul has been asked to serve as an integrator, integrating sort of economics and the humanities. His paper argues that technical economics has constrained optimization, regression analysis, mathematical model building, and it cannot resolve its own deepest puzzles with these tools alone. So he suggests that Christian anthropology is uniquely positioned to supply what is missing for technical economics to become a more fuller, humane economics. Deanna Thomas, our third panelist, is a professor of economics at Creighton University's Heider College of Business here in this building. And her research spans institutional economics, public choice, and regulatory economics. Deanna has been asked to serve as a prophetic skeptic on this panel. Her paper argues that the foundational problem with standard economics is an anthropological one before it's methodological, that the discipline presupposes a closed account of the human person, sealed off to meanings that are only referencing their own preference ranking. So her paper is going to ask, what kind of being is the human person? And what does that require economists to acknowledge? Her answer, getting the anthropology right, protects the space in which genuine human flourishing can unfold. Thank you for coming to the panel, and our first speaker is Stephen Mueller.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for setting up my talk so well, because you've saved me some time. I don't have to spend as much time talking about Vernon Smith and Bart Wilson's project on humanomics. I don't have to spend as much time on Mary Hirschfeld and her background. So that's good. I can just kind of go into it and talk about them. I think with this panel, we really have kind of two goals. Certainly with this special issue in the articles we wrote, there are two goals. One of the goals is to encourage economists to be more human, but we also have a goal, especially here with this audience, the Ciceronian Society, to encourage humanities scholars to maybe be more economistic. And so I'm gonna push on that a little bit toward the end of this. So this is Adam Smith next to Vernon Smith. Vernon Smith's co-author on much of this work in humanomics is Bart Wilson. What is their project? Their project is to return to a study and reflection on human values, something they believe was central to Adam Smith's analysis of how an economic system had emerged in Britain, one where strangers seek to create value for each other. So their project is to take this humanistic element of Adam Smith that's not just in The Wealth of Nations, but especially is in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and to bring some of that approach, actually, they'd like to bring almost all of that approach back into economic science. I call this project MIHA, Make Economics Human Again. Now, that is not what Vernon Smith is known for, and it's not even what Vernon Smith is known for co-authoring with Bart Wilson for. Vernon Smith won the Nobel Prize in economics for experimental economics. And what Vernon found in economics experiments, and I don't have time to explain how economics experiments work. If you're skeptical, that's fine, but I'll tell you the upshot of Vernon's research over all those years. Is that people are far more likely to try and create value for each other and serve each other's needs than modern mechanical economic theory would actually predict. You don't need perfect competition. You don't need price-taking firms. You don't need homogeneous products. You don't even necessarily need repeated interaction between people. Something about dealing with other human beings makes most of us tend to treat them as humans. Other people are not mere means to our own ends. They have a dignity of their own. And this is something that economic researchers had to discover by running experiments. Go figure. Why the Humanomics project? Because what they believe is that this has been abandoned in the economics discipline, or largely abandoned. Why was it abandoned? Well, I have a bit of a historical explanation for that. My version of this is that Adam Smith and his contemporaries of the 18th and 19th centuries had a major blind spot. They could explain why people trade. Adam Smith did this through absolute advantage. David Ricardo expanded that, refined that to something called comparative advantage. Maybe some of you remember that from classes long ago. But they could explain why people trade, but they couldn't explain exchange values, or in other words, they couldn't explain prices. And I'm not quite being fair to them. Out of comparative advantage, for example, you can get terms of trade. You can get exchange rates between two goods, or you can get a range of exchange rates that should work and make both parties better off. But you're not really explaining where prices come from. As a matter of fact, when it comes to comparative advantage, this is usually illustrated, and it comes through in Ricardo, as being about how opportunity costs differ between producers, and the idea is a producer with a lower opportunity cost has a comparative advantage. However, Ricardo basically determines that is based on how much labor you have to put into something. So the idea is the exchange value of a good is ultimately determined by how much labor goes into it. This is known as the labor theory of value, and it wasn't just Ricardo, it's in Smith. It seems baked into Marx, but it's baked into all thinkers before the 1860s. So what they were missing is that opportunity cost is not determined by quantities of labor, but it's determined subjectively. That's the late 19th century insight of Carl Menger, William Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras. For me, of the three, I prefer Menger, but that is the idea. So that was called the marginal revolution. And the marginal revolution meant that the labor theory value was out. Unfortunately, though, over the course of the 20th century, Adam Smith's moral sentiments baby was thrown out with the labor theory of value bathwater. A sophisticated and powerful set of tools known as price theory was refined. On the demand side, it was based on utility theory, and on the supply side, it was an analysis of costs. Especially on the demand side, this looks super abstract. And Mary Hirschfeld has argued that that abstraction in utility theory sneaks in a value judgment of its own. That the satisfaction of individual wants is the ultimate good, no matter what it is that people want. So to most economists who have kind of lost this moral sentiments, humane economy way of looking at things, to most economists, RuPaul's Drag Race, The Real Housewives of Atlanta, these are necessarily value-creating enterprises and sources of enrichment. Now, most economists also imagine that their lack of metaphysics isn't a lack of metaphysics, but actually a superior form of metaphysics. If you ask most economists what the main difference is between a man and an anteater, his answer is likely to be different preferences. So this is who Vernon Smith and Bart Wilson are mostly speaking to, these hyper-economistic economists. I'm trying to do something a little different. I'm trying to speak to Christian and especially Catholic non-economists. And the thing I think Christians should remember is that economic systems can either promote or disrupt human flourishing. My argument in the paper is that only one economic system is consistent with human dignity, and that's the one we could call free enterprise or free market capitalism or whatever. Why do I say that? Why do I say that's the only one that's consistent with human dignity? The answer is that all other existing economic systems are too rigid to be compatible with human dignity. And that's because they encourage a scarcity mindset. Maybe a better way to put it is that they encourage reasoning from scarcity. I like to say that there are three negative maxims for the economic way of thinking. Never reason from statements. Never reason from a price change. Never reason from an accounting identity. And never reason from scarcity. We don't reason from price changes in economics. We're supposed to reason our way towards them from things that affect demand or supply. We're not supposed to reason from accounting identities because they are not causal mechanisms. If you reason from accounting identities, for example, you might end up thinking that reducing imports will boost GDP because there's a negative sign on imports in the GDP equation. Doesn't work that way. They're subtracted out because they've already been added in as part of consumption or government expenditures or business investment. And we don't reason from scarcity. We reason from the trade-offs that people make in the face of scarcity. So let's go back to the late 18th century, 1798. When Thomas Malthus observed that the food supply can only grow linearly as more land is developed for agriculture, but human population grows exponentially. Because of this tension, there must be checks, his word, checks on human population growth. Famine, disease, and war are the primary ones he names. These checks obviously work by removing humans, and that slows population growth. Malthus also believed that preventative checks were possible. Celibacy, delayed marriage, and contraception. I'd add that historically, other checks in many societies have included infanticide and the abandonment of the elderly, and that the obvious modern equivalents of those are abortion and euthanasia. So my contention is that Malthus was wrong. And he was wrong. Why? He was wrong because he was reasoning from scarcity. He didn't understand what you might call the paradox of scarcity. Scarcity forces trade-offs, but the process of making trade-offs can produce greater abundance. You need private property rights and freedom of exchange for that to work. But at the time of his writing, we know he was wrong because Adam Smith in 1776 was marveling at how abundance was being created. And Smith concluded that that was because of greater division of labor in Britain. But furthermore, history has proven Malthus wrong. I don't need to go back to the time of Malthus's writing of the essay on human population. Let's just look at the past 50 years. During the past 50 years, the world's population doubled from 4 billion to 8 billion. And during that time, the extreme poverty rate dropped from half, 50%, to around 8%. What is extreme poverty? Think of it as just barely being at subsistence level. Billions of people over the last 50 years were lifted out of subsistence during a period of exponential population growth. That's the most anti-Malthus thing that could have ever happened. And it wasn't because of the checks of war, famine, abortion, and contraception that this occurred, but despite them. In a free enterprise system, With expanding global trade, humans are good for humanity. As Julian Simon observed, each person is born with only one mouth to feed, but two hands and a mind to create. More people does not mean that there's less to go around, because people are creators, stewards, and cooperators. Under rigid economic systems like feudalism, mercantilism, and all forms of socialism, population growth is a problem. It's a problem because economic roles are themselves rigid. And population growth creates pressure that can only be relieved by Malthusian checks. The Soviet and Chinese famines of the 20th century were not accidents or bad luck. Their economic systems made those checks necessary. And those states' support of abortion was also deliberate. I hope I don't need to explain it to this crowd or convince this crowd, but most Malthusian checks are contrary to human flourishing. Most economic systems, especially socialism, promote a view of humanity that is contrary to dignity. The way to view free enterprise is that in a world of 8 billion people, it is a necessary condition for flourishing. It's not a sufficient one, but it's necessary. Free enterprise will produce economic goods that also function as moral bads. So I'm making a bit of a 2 tiers for free enterprise case here. It's not a full-on 3 tiers. Free enterprise is compatible with flourishing and dignity, but it doesn't guarantee them. And that's because I believe dignity is an input, not an output. Economics cannot provide its own metaphysics or moral philosophy. And so economists who think they have that on their own are wrong, and that's what they're missing. Now, maybe some of my fellow papists out there are asking about distributism in their minds. So what about distributism? I address this in the paper, but it's worth pointing out that most distributists begin their defense of Chesterton and Bell-Lux, I'll be charitable, of their understandable economic ignorance by saying, well, distributism isn't just an economic system. I would say, in other words, it's not an economic system. There's no theory of value underneath it to help us understand what it is or how it would work, and there's certainly no price theory of any sort. The principles of Catholic social teaching can only help us compare economic systems if we understand economics. We need to understand neoclassical utility maximization aspects of price theory in order to see that approach's shortcomings. But we also need to study Adam Smith to make economics human again. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael, for putting this panel together. Thank you all for being here. My talk's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to highlight just some of the puzzles in economics that we run into when we take an overly narrow point of view. And so I'm going to raise some issues, some puzzles, but none of this should be taken as a reason to abandon economics, just as we wouldn't abandon antibiotics because it can mess with your stomach. All right, antibiotics have its purpose, right? Maybe there are downsides or drawbacks, but what I want to talk about is the role of philosophy when we're thinking about how we do economic theory, how we apply economic theory to the world. I was thinking with the last panelist, there's a joke sometimes for economists that economists like to say, yeah, it works in the real world, but does it work in theory? And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out if things that actually work in theory. So let me talk about some puzzles we run into in an overly narrow or mathematical approach to economics. And these are very important problems. Problems around unhappiness and discontent, problems around addiction, problems around efficiency versus aesthetics, And I think we're having a moment, to say the least, on the right of the political spectrum, because there's a lot of talking past each other in terms of what's going on in the country and whether economic theory or economic growth policies can deal with some of the felt needs and concerns that people have. So let me walk through just a few things I talk about in the paper. I'm happy to send it to anybody who wants to read it. The first problem that we run into is what I call the Great Gatsby problem. Okay, most of you are probably familiar with the Great Gatsby. It's a book about socialites in the 1920s period. Gatsby is this wealthy, partying sort of person, a lot of socialites from New York. And what's striking about the book is that you have all of these wealthy people socializing, partying, and they're all deeply unhappy, right? That's kind of one of the under themes of the book. They're all very unhappy. And the problem you run into in a very narrow economic model where we think about constrained optimization, utility maximization, people make choices to satisfy their preferences, is that a sort of narrow or simplistic economist approach to that is, well, they need more consumption options, right? They're constrained. They're not getting enough utility. That's why they're unhappy, right? But again, you just spend a little bit of time thinking about it, reading the book, and you realize, consumption is not really their problem. They've got other kinds of problems. And so then the question is, well, what is the economist going to say or do when it comes to this problem of discontent, if it's not simply a matter of satisfying one's preferences, which leads into this challenge that some economists have written about, more philosophers have written about it, the idea of meta-preferences, or if you think about it in the Christian context, the idea of division within the soul, right? You think about Paul writing in Romans about the war that's going on between the flesh and the spirit. And so what you find in sort of a theological or a philosophical view is that people can make choices that they're unsatisfied with and then continue to make those choices, right? There's a kind of conflict that can emerge where people are making choices that don't ultimately lead to either flourishing in an Aristotelian or a Christian sense, or even in any kind of lasting happiness. And so the idea of meta-preferences is really important because one of the challenges you face as an economist, if you take a constrained optimization model, you say, well, people want stuff in different amounts, and the more they can get to the things that they like, the better off they'll be. But how do you judge whether the preferences are good or not? Sometimes people wish that they wanted something else, right? I know I do sometimes, where I want the chocolate cake, but I'm not sure if I really want the chocolate cake. There's the war that goes on. There's obviously more important conflicts that emerge. But how do we arbitrate whether the things that we want are good or not, right? If we want to be a different person, what kind of a preference is that? And how would we map that onto decisions about our constraints and our optimization? And then there's this element of recursivity, right? Maybe I wished I was the kind of person who wanted to be different. And so there's layers here. So Amartya Sen has written about this. Others have written about this. And this also, I think, plays into the very obvious problem we run into in terms of elements of addiction, right? Addiction by its nature is repeated choices and habits and things that are done in sort of a moment, they're chosen, and yet there's regret and there's wishing that one was not making those kinds of choices. And so how do we think about that? What are we doing in that situation? And what does economics have to say about that? I raise that as a puzzle that requires more than, again, a utility function to unravel and to understand. Then we also, obviously moving into the issue of ethics, right? So something that any good economist will tell you is that preferences are subjective, right? Subjective utility. I like chocolate, you like vanilla. I like the Knicks, you like the Bulls, whatever it is. All of this subjective preferences, and there's true, right? Subjective utility. We have different tastes and preferences. And yet somehow we can talk about the preference for chocolate versus vanilla. There's no moral judgment here, or maybe a little bit of moral judgment, but not real ethical judgment, right? When it comes to chocolate or vanilla. But what about monogamy versus prostitution? Is that just a preference? Somehow we've crossed from trivial or value-free kinds of preferences to things that have significant moral weight. And it's not just, well, I prefer prostitution and you prefer monogamy. All of a sudden, we're not just talking about preferences anymore. We're talking about other things that are going on. And we could multiply examples here. And so somewhere we have to draw the line, or at least think about, okay, preferences may be subjective, but that doesn't mean they're all equal. And so what's our framework for assessing the kinds of preferences that we have ourselves or that other people have in the world? And again, there's a lot of conversation around this when we think about family, children, various kinds of public policy issues, choices about career and how much time you spend in a career and work versus other kinds of recreational activities. And this goes back, we're talking about Adam Smith. This is the year of Adam Smith, 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations. And one of the things that surprised me, and I wrote about in grad school with Adam Smith, is that in Adam Smith, you find in a couple places where he condemns people's choices of consumption, which was very weird going into graduate school. It's all subjective utility. Well, why would you condemn some kinds of consumption and not others? Like, it's all subjective. What's the point here? And the point for Smith, again, because he's a moral philosopher, is that some forms of consumption cut against human flourishing and happiness over time. And so there's an element of virtue that should be combined with consumption, and Smith has that. So he has a book on moral theory, he has a book on society, but he brings those things together at different times. And so again, this is the question: where does human flourishing and virtue come into play when we judge markets, market behavior, consumption choices, and the public policies that promote or discourage those kinds of activities? Another example here that I like to point out, and again, this is part of our conversation that's ongoing, is that economists have an aesthetics problem. Okay? And the aesthetics problem is that economists are very good about talking about efficiency and production. Right? That's what we study, that's what we talk about. There's a lot of good things about efficiency and production. But I recall when I was working at a think tank years ago, we did this exercise. People split up in the room. We had our poster boards. One group was supposed to draw a poster promoting socialism, and the other group was going to draw a picture promoting capitalism. Okay, I was part of the group promoting capitalism, and we drew this iPhone. It was awesome. iPhones are really great. The socialist drew a picture of a guy on a bench with newspapers on him. Right? And it doesn't matter how good the iPhone is, the guy on the bench without shoes is much more appealing, of like, we ought to do something about that. Like, we should care about that. Even though, there's all kinds of, reasons we could argue that we're just jumping to conclusions here, we're drawing on heartstrings, but there's something that's really important or appealing about that, right? Think about the current mayor of New York City, right? An avowed democratic socialist. Why was he successful? Not because he had good economic theory, right? It's terrible economic theory or non-existent. But because he was able to appeal to people, what people were concerned about, what they tapped into. So we have to think about the aesthetics as well as the efficiency. And so that leads to another point. This is a broader point to be thinking about. What are markets for? What is the human end that they're for? Certainly they satisfy various kinds of needs and desires, right? The clothing, food, housing, human pursuits, they're important in that regard. But markets are also about human creativity, they're about innovation, and they're about flourishing. And so one thing we want to be thinking about is not being GDP exclusivists. That is to say, we just focus on GDP growth. GDP growth is important. I would like to have higher GDP growth as opposed to lower GDP growth. But you can understand why people might say, you know what, why are you so concerned about 3.5 versus 3.3 if we can get American jobs back? Or if we can improve national security? Again, it's a kind of aesthetic, emotional, but also kind of a flourishing kind of appeal. And so one of the things that I'll leave you with here is, how do we address that? And there's a book by a Harvard economist named Benjamin Friedman called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. And the argument that Friedman makes that I find very compelling, and I think it matches a lot of survey data about happiness and contentment. What you find is that greater wealth does not actually lead to a lot higher levels of reported happiness. There's a little bit of variation at certain levels, but on the whole, someone who makes $200,000 is not happier in any meaningful way than someone who makes $150,000 in the survey data. And so one of the challenges we face is that we live in the wealthiest society ever. Lots of opportunity, lots of choice, lots of unhappy people. Now, what Friedman talks about, the moral consequences of economic growth, is he says what's important here is not particularly the level of wealth that people have. Obviously, we would like to have more wealth as opposed to less. But what actually matters from a social standpoint, from a personal standpoint, is changes in one's wealth over time, right? And what Friedman points out is he says, if you look at periods of U.S. history where the economy is growing well, you see a lot less political violence. You see a lot less domestic violence. You see a lot less fighting across different racial and ethnic groups. And then periods where there's low economic growth or recessions or depressions, you see upticks in unrest, in violence, and so forth. And so part of my advocacy for markets, open markets, free markets, is that what matters is really the dynamism of the economy rather than any particular level of wealth. The idea that there's opportunity to create, to improve one's life, to improve one's situation. And I think that's part of the issues that we're facing right now, and a lot of the discontent that we see is many people don't feel like there's much improvement available to them, right? They feel stuck, or they're told that they're stuck, or they don't see improvements in their communities. And again, this is a question that is related to economics and economic policy for sure. You want to understand why people are in communities that aren't doing very well. There's a lot of regulatory reasons I could tell you why those communities are not doing very well. We could talk about tax policy. We could talk about building code restrictions. We could talk about government services that are not provided very well, high levels of taxation. And yet it's also important to understand what is at stake here. Is it just a matter of handing people money or trying to improve their level? Or is there some kind of participatory element that people need to have in the economy that is meaningful here? So to kind of wrap up here, the point I want to make is that the economics profession has become a lot more technical, focused especially on math. And if you look at the top programs, they're basically mathematicians who sometimes work on economic problems. But we need philosophy because philosophy helps us understand how and why and when to apply the tools of economic analysis, right? And they are tools and they are valuable. You shouldn't reject hammers because someone misuses them, right? There's proper ways to use hammers, and then there's situations where you don't need a hammer, okay? So the tools of economics are tools, and they're valuable and useful, and we ignore them at our peril, and we have all kinds of historical and current examples of people who ignore or downplay economic tools because they're upset about other kinds of problems. And so that's what we need to figure out. When and how do we use those tools? So the last thing I'll say, I'll just mention Friedrich Hayek because I'm not sure he's been mentioned yet. Hayek is a good place to start if you haven't read Economists. He's very accessible. One of the things that Hayek talks about that I think is useful in understanding the philosophical versus the technical element of economics is he talks about the difference between the extended order, broad society that we interact with thousands of strangers, right? I flew here this morning, interacted with a lot of people I never met that I might not never see again, right? That's the extended order versus when I'm interacting with my family, lots of repeated relationships and all kinds of responsibilities and duties that are tied to that, or friends here that I'm reconnecting with. And so what Hayek says is we have to be able to use judgment about the kind of order that we're operating in. Certain kinds of rules make sense when we're going to the grocery store or walking through the airport, and different kinds of rules apply in a familial or a friendship setting. And again, it's this philosophy element that helps us understand, okay, what kind of issue are we talking about? Are we talking about resource constraints where people are poor and they don't have very many opportunities to improve their lives? Or are we talking about soul work and spiritual issues where people do have resources, they're making poor choices, and that's why they're unhappy? And so we have to be able to distinguish between those things so that we can use economics properly to solve the problems that we can, but then welcome in other disciplines to solve the problems that economic theory alone can't solve. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for having me for this panel. I was not actually one of the contributors to the special issue, so it's a special privilege that I get to participate here. In part, that might be because I'm married to the organizer of the panel, in case you were wondering what the names, the same name had to signify. So my contribution to this effort to make economics human again, to the MIHA effort, is to try to operationalize at least a little bit this desire to make economics more human. So make Homo economicus, which is insufficiently human, more human. And to try to better explain the levels of trust and reciprocity that we can actually observe in the economy and in the laboratory, as Steve mentioned. So as you already heard, Vernon Smith and Bart Wilson have this book, Humanomics, that they published in 2019. And in that book, they proposed that we replace our model of Homo economicus in economics with what they call a sentiments model. And their sentiments model is based on Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. And mostly what replacing our model entails is to account for humans not just as self-interested maximizers of their own well-being, but as agents that have fellow feeling, that have a desire to reward praiseworthy behavior on the part of others and to punish blameworthy behavior. And that's an important advance, I think, over the purely thin model of preference maximization that economists otherwise rely on. But I think for the Christian economists, there's an alternative path, and I think maybe a more courageous path that we can take. Rather than just adding on ethics and moral sentiments to Homo economicus, I think we should begin with a more Christian anthropology as the informing account of human agency in our models. So the question, I think, is not merely how to supplement economics, but with some moral content, but what kind of human person should we assume exists in our models? And what should we presuppose in order to make exchange and cooperation in the economy more legible than we are currently able to see? So my central claim is that a Christian anthropology offers a thicker and more coherent account of agency, and that it provides a stronger foundation for understanding cooperation and spontaneous coordination. So in some sense, what I'm going to argue is that a Christian anthropology actually allows us to defend liberalism in a better way than economics otherwise can. So to back it up a little bit, I just want to explain why I think Homo economicus is insufficient. So first of all, Homo economicus is insufficient for the reasons that Steve already mentioned. Cooperation is not something that economists can explain beyond self-interest. We have a hard time understanding trust and reciprocity, moral restraint and solidarity. Those are all things that economists can see because we can observe that people cooperate more than what our model predicts. But we have to insert ad hoc sort of explanations beyond strict rationality to account for them. So we have repeated games, reputation effects, refinements of equilibrium models, and then we also have behavioral modifications that we use to explain why people cooperate so much. And while those explanations are obviously illuminating and helpful, they're ad hoc, like I mentioned. Now, economists have often claimed that this actually makes their models stronger because with very thin models, we can explain a lot about the world. That's at least Milton Friedman's claim. But a lot of the time, it also means that cooperation kind of seems anomalous to economists. And I think specifically cooperation in the context of collective action seems anomalous to economists. So we have a bias towards planning and intervention, not among libertarian economists, but generally in the field. So the second thing that I think is a downside of our Homo economicus model is that it underestimates the potential for voluntary cooperation. Because it treats humans as too closed. We are modeling humans as closed with respect to their own preferences. Economists don't talk about preferences. Preferences are subjective and not subject to critique. We model humans as closed with self-regarding optimization. So I'm optimizing my own well-being. And I'm closed, or humans are closed within a narrow account of rationality. So then we don't understand coordination. At least not to the extent that we see it in the real world. So our model explains exchange in a very minimal sense, and it struggles to explain why persons trust strangers, why they accept obligations even when they're not fully contractually specified, and why we act constructively in collective action situations. So the problem isn't that economics takes incentives too seriously. Incentives are still powerful. The problem is that incentives alone are not an anthropology, not a full anthropology. And so this is where I think a Christian anthropology can come in and be helpful. So what's a Christian anthropology, or how do I define it? I think a Christian anthropology begins not with preferences, but with the person. So the person is not a chooser first, but and later a bearer of meaning, but first the person is given before they choose. So what that means is that we are created in the imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God, and we have dignity as a result. I think somebody that has attended more Ciceronian society meetings than I have tells me that this is something that Peter Lawler also wrote about, and you guys will have to help me out with some references after this. So if dignity is prior to deliberation and exchange, then there are some implications of that. Moral dignity follows from our ontological dignity, the fact that we're created in God's image. And because persons have a given nature and worth, their actions are accountable. This, I think, relates to what Paul was saying about meta-preferences, right? Because we're accountable to the way that we were created, we have to reconcile with what our purpose is in some sense. Another implication is that people are ends and not means, or cannot be treated as means. And the bigger fallout is that I think if we model people as anthropologically endowed with dignity, then they are open in three important ways that economists have underestimated. I know to somebody in the humanities, being open in three different ways probably still sounds very limited, but to economists, this is revolutionary, I promise. So I think that dignity makes it possible for our human actors and our models to be open upwards. Okay, so with respect to teleology, we're not self-grounding, we are created. Our dignity is received, and it's not just a fallout from our own preferences or choices. And our agency unfolds within a created order. Humans can also be laterally open if they have dignity. So that means if I have dignity, I also have to recognize your dignity. And now we're in a situation where we're treating each other differently than just maximizing our own preferences, right? You're not just a constraint in my utility function or a constraint in my budget. You're not in my budget constraint in some sense. You're not in the prices that we observe in markets only. You are a real human that I have to interact with, and you're a bearer of dignity. So that gives us a totally different understanding of reciprocity and trust that economists otherwise can't account for. And then in the last way that I think a Christian anthropology allows us to model humans that's open is forward-facing. And this is where Providence comes in. So human action is not exhausted by immediate optimization. Persons act towards ends, and they do not fully control those ends always. And that openness points towards providence, towards a direction that's meaningful and emerging, yet not controlled, but the outcome of plural action. Providence is not just a theological add-on here. And if you want to read more about this, you can go to Mary Hirschfeld, who draws on Aquinas, to talk more about how God governs creation through secondary causes. Human beings remain genuine causes in and of themselves, but they're moved. And in that way, providence makes it possible to understand order within what otherwise might be chaos. All right, so adopting this Christian anthropology, I think, makes some things possible for economics, and I already mentioned them at the beginning, but I just want to elaborate a little bit more. So once human agency is understood through dignity and providence, then economics can explain more than our sin model permits. It can explain cooperation beyond what Homo economicus predicts. So cooperation is no longer a puzzling deviation from rationality, but it becomes intelligible as an outgrowth of a person who's relational, morally accountable, and open to others. And we get a stronger account of plural order. So a Christian anthropology strengthens the case for spontaneous order. Spontaneous order is a concept that F.A. Hayek talked a whole lot about, and you already heard about him from Paul as well. Traditionally, classical liberals defend spontaneous order, the idea of emergence, by referring to information problems and incentive problems, and also evolutionary accounts. So information problems are just problems that are the result of the fact that information is dispersed and local in nature and cannot be fully known by a central planner. So spontaneous order has the benefit that it can account for local information. When information is reconciled in a decentralized way through a price mechanism, for example, then the order that emerges has accounted for all the local information. The incentive problem that economists point to for why spontaneous order is superior has something to do with the fact that we believe that humans don't change who they are depending on what institutional context they're in. So if I'm a politician and I'm centrally planning some policy, I still am a self-interested maximizer of my own well-being from an economic perspective. And that means that I will, promote my own well-being through politics. So that's a problem for central planners and a defense of spontaneous order. Those are all really important challenges to planned order, of course, but I think they remain vulnerable in some sense. So the information problem is always subject to the critique of calculation and always has been. And classical liberal economists have not been decisive in defending against this challenge. Anytime there's a new computational technology, we always are back to, well, maybe we could still do it. Maybe we could still calculate prices, especially in, times of self-driving cars and stuff like that. So it just is constantly a challenge. The other thing that even people like F.A. Hayek have acknowledged is that spontaneous orders will sometimes generate evolutionary cul-de-sacs. So situations in which the spontaneous order that emerges is not or doesn't seem desirable from some perspective. And he even defends intervention in those cases. Now, I think a Christian anthropology provides a stronger defense of spontaneous and emergent orders because it offers a transcendent claim, right? Plural order is not merely efficient or adaptive, but it reflects the participation of dignified agents within a providential order. So that gives us a deeper reason to resist planning, because the objection is not that planners lack knowledge. The objection is that planning displaces plural agency and treats persons as manageable inputs, as means rather than ends. So where Hayek showed that planners lack the knowledge to control society, I think a Christian anthropology explains why they should never try to plan in the first place. All right, so to conclude, I think a Christian anthropology does not replace Homo economicus. It expands the model. It preserves all of the power that economics has in terms of explaining human action in the face of scarcity, incentive problems, and propulsive action. But it situates humans within a thicker account of what the human person is. So we get a stronger account of cooperation than economists can usually provide, and a stronger defense of a plural order, of spontaneous order. I think economics becomes richer and not weaker. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
All right, so I just have some closing remarks to try to invite you guys into this conversation and give you a structure that we can think about these three papers. So just as a reminder, I organized this panel to extend this special issue that we put together and really think about what's implied by Bart Wilson's claim that economics is missing a formal and final cause, and Mary Hirschfeld's claim that economics needs to be subordinated to virtue and human flourishing. Hirschfeld thinks that this is difficult to do from within, but I hope that you have seen economists that are trying to do this from within their profession, and maybe we can look at one of these methods to understand why she is wrong, that we can actually do this from within economics with your help. So just to review, the material and efficient causes, that's what economists work with. So I think the material cause is just scarcity. There's not enough stuff to go around, right? So the material, the stuff, is scarcity, and the basic tool of thinking about efficient causes is incentives, right? Economists think about price incentives, other types of incentives that motivate them. But then this leaves out the final and formal causes. And the Ciceronian Society is exactly the place that we want to talk about final causes, right? We opened this session, and we've opened every session I've been to today with prayer, right? That's indicating, pointing at, taking seriously the final cause. Now, it's interesting because in each of those sessions, we have a different method or idea about what prayer should be, right? We have prayer in different ways. And that's also a very big strength of this group of people. So that's the formal causes that can differ. So we can get together and think about this with a final cause in mind, with different formal expressions of what that might and should look like. So the basic question that I have proposed in organizing this panel is humanomics a complement or a substitute to practicing economics? Substitute means that we have to abandon the project of fixing it within. We just have to become something other than economists. But complement means that we invite everyone in the room into the discussion of economics as it should be. And you've just heard three ways to do that. So I really want to just congratulate Paul Mueller on helping me think about The Great Gatsby in a way that I haven't thought about ever. And his is the master key to sort of understanding what we're talking about here. The standard economic reading of The Great Gatsby, is a puzzle about wealth and happiness, as he described. Why does having more money not make us happy, right? That's one way to read The Great Gatsby. And so his answer is technical economics can be no good because it has no theory of what happiness actually is, only revealed preference, which is to say you choose what you choose and you want what you want, right? There's no additional explanation of this. The puzzle is invisible from within the framework that economics provides because that framework was built to avoid asking that question. But Fitzgerald gives you what regression analysis cannot. Gatsby does not simply fail to be happy despite being rich. He fails to understand what richness is. And he fails in the same way and for the same reasons that he fails to understand what love is. He gets the material and efficient causes exactly right. He acquires the mansion, the shirts, the parties, the accents, the car. He executes this mechanism flawlessly. What he cannot see, what he cannot experience, what he cannot do, because he does not know it exists, is the formal cause, inhabiting the life rather than merely performing it. He misses the final cause. What is his life for? The technical economist says, Gatsby's rich. But we should ask, is he really doing well? From the outside, he appears to be flawless, but we read the story and we see what Nick sees, and we recognize that Gatsby is hollow. To what extent are modern people just Gatsby? Because we've accepted this framework of efficient material causes as being sufficient to span the space inhabited by our humanity. This is Mueller's point about the positive normative split as a pathology. You need the humanities not to supplement the economics, but to see what the economics is blind to. Right? So connecting Mueller's paper with the other papers, Mueller's paper is a between systems argument, and it excels at doing that. It says if you're looking between systems, then you can compare which ones deliver on the types of things we want in human flourishing. But Diana and Paul give us within a system, right? Which system is best delivering on human flourishing? Fine, free enterprise, right? But Gatsby's already inside of a free enterprise system. He's doing it exactly right according to the metrics he's aware of. The failure is not a failure of the system comparison. It's a failure of understanding what the system was built for. This is a loss of final causes and a failure to refine through discussion the formal causes. What we're all doing here, right? Refining the formal causes through a discussion of reaching a final cause. Diana's argument is aimed at discussion through an open anthropology. She sees the magisterium of the church as getting the final cause right, but the formal causes need to be continually re-articulated. Closed anthropology foreclosed this discussion, and an open anthropology requires discussion, and this is where dignity lives. First, get the anthropology right, and then the space for genuine flourishing is protected. Protecting a space for genuine flourishing. Gatsby's tragedy is not that his anthropology was closed in the technical sense. He's oriented towards Daisy. It's something beyond himself, and it looks from the outside like the most open possible orientation. His is a failure of formation. He has not been shaped by a tradition that can tell him the difference between love and infatuation. This is learned by experience and not simply a matter of execution. Diana's open anthropology leaves space for formation because it does not assume that the answers are easy, resolved, or that you can cut and paste them. We are not so easily tricked into complacency when we foreground the complexity of human yearning. Mueller's argument captures complexity, but perhaps his only flaw is his optimism about how institutions can be corrected to guide this yearning process. By asking the economists to be philosophers, he risks jumping past yearning to the process of resolution. Economic philosophers offer answers based on their interpretations of tradition, which is distinct from Diana's sense that the most important parts of the tradition are these walls built to protect subsidiarity and block the formal causes that would be offered by men of system. The humanities are equipped to ask these questions, not because they have some vast magisterium that answers all the questions and catalogs the answers from a timeless tradition, but because they've developed over centuries the formal processes, the narrative, the character, the tragedy, the recognition that allow us to even know what the questions are that we're supposed to be asking. Mueller is calling us to read more widely and to be culturally literate, and he's inviting his fellow economists to stare into an abyss before they seek to try to fill it with easy answers. Economists who cannot ask big questions, why the experimental subjects cooperate beyond what rational self-interest predicts, why wealth does not produce happiness, and why preferences are often nested and contain conflicts. These economists are unlikely to return from the abyss with anything meaningful to tell the rest of us. These puzzles are not anomalies to be explained away like behavioral economists suggest. They are the empirical shadow of the formal and final causes that technical economics has rejected. Fitzgerald already knew this. Aristotle already knew this. Our traditions, various as they are, already know this. The question we have to ask is whether economists are willing to learn it too. So my answers to what we've talked about today is that positive economics without normative economics has failed. The idea that only efficient material causes can provide guidance for human flourishing just fails. That version of economics is a substitute, and Mary Hirschfeld is right to say that you can't fix that sort of economics from within. However, when economics has an open anthropology, as we've been given from Diana Thomas's paper, human error is foregrounded. And we can have the dignity to make our own mistakes so that we can learn from them, and so can others. The humanities are complementary to Diana Thomas's understanding of economics as error identification. What Stephen Mueller shows us is this error identification can happen at the systems level, or what you might call macroeconomics, comparison between systems where you see systematic flaws and avoid obvious mistakes in designing economic systems. To bring in Lawler. This fits within the larger context of the Ciceronian society. Peter Lawler would remind us that we are neither autonomous Enlightenment selves nor postmodern victims of social construction. We are stuck between beast and angel, between our impulses and our rationality, to put it in my own terms, and we have to resist the technocratic solution. But Diana is right that there is a soft technocratic turn that happens in ways that I think Mueller and Mueller are less attentive to in their papers. And human error needs to be a bigger part of the kind of economics that we promote. Gadsby masters the mechanism, but misses the meaning. The framework he's using cannot tell him that he misses it, or that there's even something there to miss. Through Mueller's framework, reading Fitzgerald this way can help explain why technical economics cannot offer a synthesis that informs praxis. The evaluation of a connection between formal and final causes is the scientific problem that economic analysis has hidden from itself. Thank you.
My question is for Dr. Diana Thomas. I was wondering if I loved your paper. Is this a non-starter in secular contexts? How might you recommend starting this discussion with people who don't buy some of those premises? This kind of seems like the issue I get into in philosophy courses where we're trying to ground equality in something. I'm just wondering any tips for someone to find this compelling, or if you have any way to enter that kind of conversation. I know that's a really tough question.
I don't have any good answers, honestly. I mean, you're right. It's a non-starter in secular circles, absolutely. Even humanomics, despite the fact that it's not theologically grounded at all, is a non-starter for most economists. So it's a hard sell. But I think, you know, given that I'm arguing for a Christian anthropology, and I believe that entails individuals acting and reconciling, being accountable, right? I have to start with, what do I do? And so, I mean, I think just being open and honest about your own commitments is the only thing I can do on my own. That's the best answer I got. I don't know.
I mean, I'll just add briefly there. I guess part of the approach that I would take, and that I think is part of the conversation going on here, is that there's been sort of this assumption of secularism as ascendant. And I think contesting that and saying Christians should have a seat at the table, like, it's absurd to argue that we can just abandon Christian premises and ignore them based on, you know, the last 1,500 years of history. So, you know, it's a little bit more in your face, but I kind of say, like, it's absurd for you to dismiss this out of hand, you know, as someone who's interested in knowledge and history and tradition. And so anyway, so that's the approach I take of, you know, you need to give me a good reason why that Christians shouldn't have a seat at the table as a way of thinking about things.
Your question, for some reason, made me wonder what if Mary Hirschfeld hadn't started as an economist, but had started as a moral philosopher. And I think as a woman of faith, as a Christian moral philosopher, if she had ended up at some secular institution, much like she did as an economist, she would have had a similar frustration and disillusionment process, because she would have said, what is going on? What is with these moral philosophers? They're twisting themselves in knots. They're either making weird arguments about moral obviousness, which I'm almost a fan of moral obviousness, but there's just think about it's a non-philosophical moral philosophy. It's saying, I don't know. It's obvious. It's wrong to kill people. Right. Why? What's going on there? And so she still would have ended up in theology. So I wonder about that secular thing a lot, because that's what we're dealing with. Most of the economics profession is secular, and that's why they're able to cling to their non-metaphysical way of seeing things.
So Bart in Meaningful Economics tries to naturalize it by just saying groups survive and these norms are robust and they sort of evolve over time. So he's trying to take that out of it. I mean, he's also not committed to a tradition, but I think it's promising that he goes back to Aristotle to try to ground it. He's scared that people are going to push him to Thomas, which is why Mary Hirschfeld's in the conversation.
I guess I'm raising my hand, but I already have the mic. I really want to engage on the Gatsby conversation, but I'm going to restrain myself and just ask a stupid question from a non-economist here. But I think it's an important threshold question to get Christian conservative folks on board with the free market question. So I think most people here have probably had some kind of conversation like this, where gut instinct is, I want to be on board with free market economics. I haven't really studied it, but it makes sense. And then you get some person who identifies as some kind of libertarian, capitalist, whatever, who explains to you that in the name of their free market values, the state can't ban pornography, recreational drugs, all kinds of things that are harmful to the human person and human flourishing, right? Everyone on this panel has kind of touched on this issue a little bit, but I think it would be helpful if there's whoever wants to take this, like a kind of clear answer to, can we both be adherents to the free market and in favor of the state banning harmful things like pornography? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that, like, part of my argument is that we should be able to take those moral stances. Now, the caveat is that what economics helps us do is understand, will those policies be effective in the things that we want them to do? And that's where I think the interesting conversation is. So whether it's decriminalization versus legalization, say, of recreational drugs, what's the difference between cocaine or fentanyl or marijuana? What are some of the outcomes there, right? And then we also have to think through, okay, what's the gradation of destructive behaviors, right? And so there's a lot of questions that have to be resolved here, where we think about things that are sort of obviously wrong from a Christian standpoint versus things that might be destructive in many cases, but can also be engaged in moderation, right? Whether it's fast food or soft drinks or other kinds of things. So, again, I would take the position of sort of a localized view, and I would respond to kind of the radical libertarians who say, like, that's off the table. And I don't think you can make the claim that that's off the table unless you take sort of a radical skepticism towards metaphysics and ethics. But there are a lot of caveats in terms of I would be very hesitant to having states do a lot of restrictive things unless I had, again, sort of compelling reasons why I thought it was incentive compatible and people had sort of options to experiment. So I don't know if that really answers your question. So I understand where you're coming from. I'm open to it, but the economist part is, okay, what are the actual incentives we're going to generate here? Who's going to implement the program? What kind of unintended consequences may emerge? And what's the best way to maybe not solve the problem, but to mitigate it, right? And so one of the challenges of economists, right, is we say there's always trade-offs and no solutions. And so that would be part of the answer to your question.
Maybe in defense of the crazy libertarians. So I think, from my perspective, and I'm not a moral philosopher and not a theologian, but to me, the thing that always gives me trouble with promoting intervention to combat problems regarding human flourishing is what Michael pointed to, which I did not mention this at all, but he said I did, about error correction, right? So in some sense, dignity, I think, or the understanding humans as created in the image of God requires us to allow them to be accountable on their own terms. And that means sometimes people make mistakes and we can't systematically prevent that, right? Unintended consequences. People will find ways to consume drugs, even if some things are outlawed. So that doesn't mean that you cannot live in communities that outlaw certain things, right? I would be happy to live in a community that outlaws abortion and recreational drugs, whatever, as long as it's a sort of like a voluntary agreement, right, among the people that I'm in community with to have those sorts of restrictions.
Since Paul mentioned drugs, I'll mention pornography. My take is it's similar to Paul's in that, I would say a ban on something like that is not off the table, but you have to think really hard about what the consequences are and all of that. And what I've seen over my life in terms of how people use pornography is that something changed, not so much in the legality of it, but in how culturally acceptable it was. So I'm old enough that when I was a kid, the idea of being caught with a dirty magazine was shameful, right? And you were ashamed of even wanting to have one of those things in your hands, right? And so it is more about, and it's a much harder task, right, than banning something. It's a much more difficult task to say, we need to work back towards moral norms that actually support human dignity.
Well, and what I would add here, so there's a lot of layers of complication here. So one of the challenges is what kind of permission we give to communities to police themselves. And so to take a different example, if you think about Jonathan Haidt's work on smartphones, right? One of the challenges with smartphones is, you think about, I lean towards, okay, parents have the primary role in monitoring their kids and decide when to let them have smartphones. But if your kids are in any kind of normal public school and all of their classmates have public phones, you have a serious kind of externality sort of problem that might require decisions at the school level around smartphone policy and so forth, which is not exactly government restriction, although it is sort of a government institution. So anyway, I'm sympathetic to, and I think we should think about what are the mechanisms for sort of community kind of policing in a voluntary sense, like Deanna's talking about, are mostly voluntary in terms of there's a communal element. But there are things that are not just personal decisions or even limited within, say, a family, but there's a more kind of either cultural or social element to them. So I think there are issues like this that are tough questions, and there's a lot of incentives to trace out and authority to trace out, but I'm not opposed to those kinds of conversations.
Hi. So this is kind of making my head spin because my own discipline couldn't be further from economics, but it has exactly the same problem, which is the notion that any sort of moral connection to it is completely separated. So my first question is any sort of moral connection completely separated? I mean, can economists be aphilosophical? So that's my first issue is that, and that actually ties into your question about what to do yes, you seeded. Sorry, but we can talk later about that. My other one is about what I think it's Dr. Thomas said about humanities have asked all the questions. And I wonder if you could explain what you mean by that.
I'll just say briefly, I mean, part of what I argue in the paper is that I think most economists are sort of like soft utilitarians, right? So it's sort of like the greatest good for the greatest number and or no harm principle. And so some combination of those things of, okay, if it's freely chosen, then there's not really much we can say about it in any kind of official capacity. We can maybe sort of say we don't really, well, I wouldn't make that choice, but is there any kind of moral thing going on here? I think economists are very hesitant to do that, again, because it's focused on utility, choice, utility, subjective preference. And then you get like the non-harm element, or in economics, we talk about something called Pareto efficiency, where, okay, someone is made better off than anybody made worse off. So there's sort of like this, I think, again, the soft utilitarianism that's going on in the background, which is just very unsatisfactory for most public policy questions, right? Around abortion, around all the kinds of issues. So that's my quick take about where so it's not like totally neutral, or I think that that's really in the background of a lot of how economists talk.
Yeah. Baked into modern economics anyway. So this is not true of Adam Smith, right? But baked into modern economics is this very bright line between normative analysis and positive analysis. And the vast majority of economists believe that it is therefore a violation of their, I don't know, whatever oath they imagine they took as economists. It's a violation to ever stray into normative analysis, so they are obliged to only give positive analysis. And as Hirschfeld points out, you're actually sneaking some normative analysis in with the way utility theory is set up. It's just a bad normative analysis. And so I think that's the main obstacle that economists have, is that most modern economists believe they're not doing economics anymore if they step into the realm of political economy and talking about people's values in a deeper sense, some notion of objective value rather than subjective.
So I think you were asking me about the question about humanities. So I went over that really fast. So thank you for asking for clarification. So I became Roman Catholic 15, 16 years ago, and there's a catechism, right? You can look up a whole bunch of rules, right? And so there's a magisterium with teaching and all these kind of things. That's what Steve was writing about, the Catholic social teaching. What I was saying about the humanities, what is appealing to me about the humanities, is that it's not a catalog of answers, it's a catalog of questions, right? So that what you do when you go and stand at this abyss, right, and think deeply about the human condition, is you come back with clarification of the questions to be asking, not a set of answers. And so I was just making a contrast between sort of a catechesis way of viewing the world versus a open inquiry about what kind of questions. So applying this to the pornography question, we know there's a problem. I mean, it's very obvious. And the question is, how do we best direct ourselves towards a true and beautiful version of love? That's the question, right? And so then the policy stuff gets really difficult. That's why I didn't comment on the policy stuff. But the question is about what we actually think love is, and why we know for certain that pornography is not that.
Thank you all for your panel. Paul, I think my question is mostly for you, but y'all seem to have been sharing the mic, so anybody who wants to jump in. I did something kind of odd for my reading habits this past term. I actually read a work of economics. Wilhelm Röpke's Humane Economy. I had a class that it just fits, and I never read it, so I assigned it, and it gave me a great excuse to finally read the thing. And Röpke has this fascinating analysis, I think, of economics as what he calls a sort of middle knowledge. He puts it on top of a base of widely accepted ethical norms, and he puts it underneath the political aims that are set by sort of a ruling set body of aristocrats who have the right taste. I don't want to ask you about the aristocrats part. I still think that's kind of idyllic. I don't think that I'm not sure I even think that's possible in the world today. But I'll ask you about the base, because this goes back to Frank's question. It seems to me that economics is incredibly good at delivering certain efficiencies. And we've now created massive systems of economic exchange that have led drug warlords to sell illegal narcotics all over the world with massive efficiency. My favorite question to irritate economists is what I call my OnlyFans scenario. If you can't tell me why OnlyFans is bad and are an economist, I'm not really that interested in your economic analysis. So all that is prefaced to say, is free market economics, as currently understood, is it possible in a post-Christian West, or does it actually depend on Christianity as that base?
So you're asking whether free market economics is possible? Yeah, I mean, it's possible. The question is, how good is it, right? I mean, so as you point out, and this is really important, markets are really good at giving people what they want, right? And they're excellent at that. And again, markets exist within a set of institutions, whether it's property, rule of law, other sorts of things. And so you need institutional construct for markets to work well. And that's mostly a matter of preventing people from violating others' rights and preventing government, most of all, from meddling with things. Now, the question is, well, what will the market society look like in a post-Christian culture? And it's going to be, mixed. It's going to reflect human nature, right? It's the authors of the Federalist paper talk about government being a reflection on human nature. Markets are a reflection on human nature, the things that people care about, the things that they want, the things that they pursue. And I think that's where we ought to engage in a lot of the conversation, right? So if you don't like what some companies are doing, try to build better ones. And if you disagree with certain kinds of products, you avoid them and you persuade others to avoid them. I mean, Jonathan Haidt, right, has waged a one-man crusade against smartphones for children. And I mean, he's been very successful in a lot of ways. I mean, not, perfectly so, but that's part of being part of an open society, a free society where there is conversation and disagreement. Now, again, I think there are some externalities that I alluded to earlier and some challenges. And part of what we want to think about is what are the, what Tocqueville called the mediating institutions, right? The sort of between the individual and the government, right? Whether that's church, whether that's family, whether that's other kinds of clubs. We have a real problem in this country, and not just in this country, around the world, of these institutions kind of failing or not being self-perpetuating in the way that they used to. So you can read Robert Nisbet on that, The Quest for Community. And that's a big challenge. And a lot of people will lay that at the feet of markets, but Nisbet doesn't. And I think he's right on that. I think what inhibits the formation a lot of these new mediating institutions is actually crowding out by various kinds of government programs. So we can think about the New Deal, we can think about the Great Society, we can think about the replacement of the Elks or the lodges or all these clubs at the turn of the 20th century that were primarily welfare kinds of organizations, right? Helping people who are sick, old age retirement. All of that's been replaced by faceless, nameless, bureaucratic institutions, whether it's Medicaid, Medicare, other kinds of welfare programs. So I would just my general approach is I'm very hesitant the way some people on the right lay all these problems at the feet of the market. And I think that's just bad diagnosis often, right? So people think about, well, markets were bad because we outsourced, to take a very narrow example, bad for national defense because we outsourced all this rare earth mineral production, right? And we outsourced it to the cheapest place in China and they took that over. No, that's not why. It's because it was basically illegal to mine those minerals here in the US. The EPA made sure of that. It was illegal to develop those industries here. And so is it a trade problem? that we no longer have, or we don't have rare earth mineral refining and development? Or is it a regulatory problem, right? And if you just study it for a few minutes, you realize it's primarily a regulatory problem. And there are many things that are like this. When you think about deindustrialization narratives, other kinds of communities that are struggling, is it primarily a trade issue, or is there some kind of regulatory tax or other kinds of thing in the background? And as you look at these things, you find there's usually something else lurking in the background. So anyway, I'm just I like to push back on, is it the markets that are driving this? Now, again, markets give people what they want. And if people want OnlyFans, they're going to get OnlyFans. And that's a problem. Like, that's something that should be concerning from a cultural, moral standpoint. But it's not exactly clear that the market itself is the problem there. Anyway, long answer.
I mean, there's a theme in some of these questions about human brokenness and despair. And no, economics does not have a solution for brokenness and despair. Free markets don't have a solution for brokenness and despair, but kind of following on Paul, I don't see them causing really on their own brokenness and despair. I go back, when I read the Old Testament, I don't see rules solving problems. There's a lot of rules in Leviticus, and people were still very broken. And I think that is the story of humanity and our relationship with God, is that we are broken because we turn away from him. We're not broken because the market tempted us.
Thank you guys very much. We have a few announcements, I think, before dinner, but